All right, so we're going to go over chapter 24 now um, in some detail, and then I have a presentation that's going to look at some of the characters more in depth, the theme, and the plot overview. So we'll start by looking at the chapter. This is basically going to take place entirely in the setting of the living room at the Finch's house. It's going to be Aunt Alexandra's missionary society meeting slash tea party slash gossip session. Um, Key players will be Scout, Aunt Alexandra, Miss Maudie versus Miss Stephanie Crawford, and we're going to contrast those two characters. And then we're also going to see Miss Merriweather. I'd say the overarching like message here is going to be looking at hypocrisy and the concept of the blatant unawareness of people outside of oneself. So, um, at the beginning of this missionary society, Scout comes into the room and she is kind of poked fun at a little bit because they're like, oh, you're wearing a dress, then where are your pants? And she says, they're under my dress, and then everybody laughs. And they say, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she says, well, I want to be a lady. And everybody laughs again. But Miss Maudie just kind of doesn't make fun of her. Miss Maudie doesn't laugh. Miss Maudie doesn't say anything, but she just kind of sits quietly and supports Scout. Whereas Miss Stephanie is the one who's looking at her suspiciously right here. It says, Miss Stephanie eyed me suspiciously. And she contented herself with, well, you won't get very far until you start wearing dresses. So Miss Stephanie's kind of provoking. And then again, we see the stability of Miss Maudie. Now we enter Mrs. Grace Merriweather. And she was a faithful Methodist, under duress, apparently saw nothing personal in singing Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound, etc. It was the general opinion in Macomb, however, that Mrs. Merriweather had sobered him up and made a reasonable, useful citizen of her husband. Mrs. Merriweather was the most devout lady in Macomb. I searched for a topic of interest to her. What did you all study this afternoon? I asked. Oh, child, those poor Maroonahs, she said, and was off. Few other questions will be necessary. So the Maroonahs were a tribe, and there's a missionary that they discuss. His name was J. Grimes Everett, and he is a missionary to the Maroonah tribe in Africa. And she says with large brown eyes that filled with tears. And so this is, again, a person that cries with emotion every time she talks. So there are those who do that. There are those who do not. Mrs. Merriweather is one of them. She says, not a white person will go near them, but that saintly J. Grimes Everett. She played her voice like an organ, and every word she said received its full measure, the poverty, the darkness, the immorality. Nobody but J. Grimes Everett knows. When the church gave me that trip, the campgrounds, J. Grimes Everett, he said to me, home, so Mrs. Merriweather, you have no conception of what we're fighting over there. That's what he said to me. Yes, ma'am. I said to him, Mr. Everett, the ladies of Macomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church South are behind you 100%. That's what I said to him. And you know, right then and there, I made my pledge in my heart. I said to myself, when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Maroonahs, and I'm going to bring J. Grimes Everett's message to Macomb, and that is just what I'm doing. Yes, ma'am. When she shook her head, her black curls jiggled. Jean Louise, you're a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there's nothing but sin and squalor. Yes, ma'am. Sin and squalor. What was that, Gertrude? Mrs. Merriweather turned on her chimes for the lady sitting beside her. Oh, that. Well, I always say forgive and forget. That thing that the church ought to do is to help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. And where are there, where is there injustice? Where is there sin? Where is there squalor? In Macomb County. It just happened. And she says this is a Christian town and a Christian home and a Christian family. Baloney. As we all know, what just happened with Tom Robinson is atrocious, and Christ would never, ever condone that. It goes with that hypocritical label of Christian. And here she is pining over this amazing man who's willing to go be a witness to like the sin and the squalor of this other nation that is sinful and full of squalor simply because most of the people there are African. And she is just demonstrating like the atrociousness of her prejudice and her pride. Um, so then they begin to talk about the Robinsons. Um, Excuse me, Mrs. Merriweather, are you talking about Mayella Yule? Oh no, child. The Tom's wife, Tom Robinson, ma'am. Mrs. Merriweather turned back to her neighbor. There's one thing I believe, Gertrude. Some people just don't see it my way. If we let them know we forgive them, that we've forgotten it, then this whole thing will blow over. Oh, Miss Merriweather, I interrupted. What'll blow over? And then she turned to me. She was one of those childless adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone when speaking to children. Nothing, Jean Louise. The cooks and the field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now, and they grumbled all next day after the trial. So Mrs. Merriweather proposes that they ought to forgive the African Americans for being upset about what happened, and that it will all blow over. So all of the white women are upset because their servants, basically, are upset about the outcome and the injustice. And so she's like, well, we just need to forgive them for their own sin. And she talks about how their mouths are sulky. It goes down. It ruins your day to have one of them in your kitchen. You know what I said to my Sophie, Gertrude? I said, Sophie, you're not being Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining. And you know it did her good. She took her eyes off the floor and said, no, ma'am, Miss Merriweather. Jesus never went around grumbling. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord. Now that ought to make your skin crawl. It's so offensive and so unkind, and I just don't have any more words. It just is. So, the day went on. She talks about, like, they keep talking about it. They're sulky, they're dissatisfied. I tell you, if my Sophie had kept it up another day, I would have let her go. It's never entered that wool of hers that the only reason I keep her is because this depression's on, and she needs her $1.25 every week if she can get it. So a couple things. She said, like, that hair of hers, they called their hair wool. It's not wool. That's treating them like an animal. That's an animalistic terminology. And then she's saying, like, I'm doing her a favor by paying her $1.25 a week to be my servant and my cook, basically. And she says the food's not very good. I don't really like it anyway. And then, let's see, they were talking about Tom Robinson's wife and, okay, so then Miss Maudie chimes in. Miss Maudie, I'm sure I don't know what you mean, said Mrs. Merriweather. I'm sure you do, Miss Maudie said shortly. She was no more. When Miss Maudie was angry, her brevity was icy. Something had made her angry, and her eyes were as cold as her voice, and Miss Merriweather reddened. She looked at me and looked away, and I could not see Mrs. Farrow. So Miss Maudie, we don't know exactly what had made her upset, but we know that something happened and she kind of snapped. And so we're going to go down further, and we see that the topic of hypocrites has come up. Hypocrites, Mrs. Perkins, both born hypocrites, Mrs. Merriweather was saying. At least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there, they set him free, but you don't see him setting at the table with him. At least we don't have the deceit to say to him, you're as good as we are, but stay away from us. Down here we just say, you live your way, we live ours. I think that woman, that Mrs. Roosevelt, has lost her mind, just plain lost her mind coming down to Birmingham and trying to sit with him. If I was the mayor of Birmingham, I'd... And so they're saying that the people in the North who treat them as equals and sit with them are hypocrites because they're saying that the African Americans are less than. And so you're giving them this pretense, this illusion of being good and better, but they're really not. Which again is just so ugly, so offensive. Before all of this can finish, Atticus came in and he called Alexander into the kitchen, and he reveals to them that Tom has died. In prison, Tom had attempted to escape, and as he was climbing over the fence, they shot him. Um, that's the quote unquote story that was told. But when he tells the story, um, he talks about how Tom was shot many different times, which is not necessary. Secondly, how could Tom climb a fence to escape with a wounded or a broken arm? Um, and so the assumption as a whole is that he was lynched or unjustly murdered in jail by the white jailers. Um, okay, so then Miss Maudie and Aunt Alexandra have, so Miss Maudie goes into the kitchen as well, and Aunt Alexandra is crying, and I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie, but he's my brother, and I just want to know when this will ever end. It tears him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears him to pieces. I've seen him. What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else? What does who want, Alexandra? Miss Maudie asked. I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him do what they're too afraid to do themselves. It might lose them a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health by doing what they're afraid to do. Be quiet and they'll hear you, said Miss Maudie. Have you ever thought of this way, Alexandra? Whether Macomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay a man. We trust him to do what's right. It's that simple. Who? Aunt Alexandra never knew. She was echoing her 12-year-old nephew. The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. The handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people with enough humility to think, when they look at a black man there but for the Lord's kindness, am I. Miss Maudie's old Christmas was returning. The handful of people in this town with a background, that's who. Had I been attentive, I would have held another scrap. Stop that shaking, commanded Miss Maudie. Get up, Alexandra. We've left them long enough. Um, and so they go back to rejoin the ladies. And so basically what Miss Maudie is saying is that, like, Atticus is not a victim, that he's being shown, like, an honor for being trustworthy and wise. And so Miss Maudie becomes sort of like the eyes through which, like, kind of the silent voice that everybody else represents. So I wanted to go over to this student project that I thought was really nice, nicely done, and look a little bit at the characters. So we've seen Jane Louise. What is Aunt Alexandra learning? Well, she cares about her family. She worries for the pursuit of justice. She notices that it's affecting Atticus, and she sort of in this moment becomes a role model for Scout. Obviously, Mrs. Merriweather is an example of extreme hypocrisy and condescension and prejudice. Miss Maudie, she does not tolerate disrespect. She snaps on Miss Merriweather when she speaks ill of Atticus. She shows a different side to the reserved and friendly and passive Miss Maudie that we've seen before. She is one whose opinion is trustworthy. She's one of the handful of people who has a similar belief to Atticus. And she's another one who does pursue justice as well. In this chapter, there's an unsettling, cold mood. Scout was trying to fit in with the ladies. As a result of Miss Maudie snapping at Miss Merriweather, she notices that even, like, she's starting to get a glimpse of what Jem was saying in the previous chapter, that there are different kinds of people, that we're not all the same. There's tragedy in this chapter, as they find out about Tom and the injustice that he has been served that has led to his death. There are themes of maturity. Scout is realizing different tones of hypocrisy and prejudice, and that there's an us and a them, that there's multiple sides even among her neighbors in Macomb. And she shows that age is not the determining factor for maturity, but rather experience and wisdom. Scout is absolutely aware of the discrimination that occurs. Family values are reinforced, that the family stands together on the same ground, and then sort of that fight for justice, that it's one tiny step at a time. So that ends chapter 23. 4.